Welcome back, and in this week's modules we will look at the history of evolutionary thinking as we move on from the modern synthesis all the way to very recent developments in biology and in psychology. I called it the manifold path because, as we will see, there will be very different perspectives on how we can use evolutionary thinking to make sense of human behavior. The issue that we will have to grapple with is how can we understand human behavioral diversity? Where does it come from? And if you remember, it's a challenge for behavior because behavior is shaped by so many different things. We talked about Meyer's distinction between proximal and distal levels of explanation already in biology. And you can imagine in psychology, with all the complexities that we have, culture, social learning, it becomes even more challenging. We know from Mendel that there is a genotype, so the information that is carried in our genes, and there's a phenotype, so the behavior, the traits that are manifested and that we can observe. We also know from Darwin that there's different information that we need to keep track of if we want to study evolutionary processes. After the modern synthesis, we know that information is passed on through genes, so we denote them with G, and they are passed on over time. So that's why we have two different time points indicating populations that pass on their genes from one generation to the next. We also have to keep track of the environment because natural selection is supposed to work as an adaptation to local conditions, to the local environment, and only those individuals and those species that can pass on their genes, so they have differential reproductive success, are important for evolutionary processes to take place. And of course, we have culture, we have learning, we have socialization. So this is something that we will keep track of in terms of the phenotypes. So there's phenotypic information that is being passed on over generations through learning, and this is also something that needs to be considered. But as you can now imagine, we can have all sorts of relationships between genes, phenotypes, and also genes over time and phenotypes over time. And this is where these different schools of thought or different paradigms differ. And we will try and keep track of these relationships between the G and the P boxes in these different theoretical paradigms as we go along. But first, let's go back to psychology and the beginning of psychology and see how was early psychology influenced by Darwin and what happened, why did evolution kind of disappear within a mainstream psychology view. So first of all, we have to talk about Wilhelm Wundt. He was initially trained as a physician again, but then he became very interested in philosophy, and it was in 1879 that he created the first experimental laboratory for psychology in the world. That was in the German city of Leipzig, and he was obviously familiar with Darwin's thinking, and he was an interesting character in the sense that he was very strongly influenced by humanist philosopher, for example Leibniz. He was aware of Darwinian thinking and he was very comfortable with it and was able, compared to a lot of other people at that time, he was able to compare and integrate Darwinian thinking with these humanist philosophers, and being trained in medicine and physiology, he would start experiments. So he immediately jumped on the idea of using experiments to test some of these ideas. The challenge was he had very few disciples, he worked in Germany, and very soon the gravity of psychology would shift to the English speaking world. So he had no students that would carry on his thinking. His thinking was very complex. I studied in Leipzig, and our professors always would tell funny stories about how he would write a lot, had very deep thoughts on all sorts of issues, and his students were always struggling to keep up with his ideas. He wrote a 10-volume book on essentially culture and psychology. Imagine that. Unfortunately, a lot of these works are not available in English, so this rich thought was very soon lost in an English-speaking psychology. If we look over to the US, the other person that is really important for the start of academic psychology is William James. He was also influenced by evolutionary thinking. He was initially very much influenced by Spencer, but over time he also took on board quite a few of the ideas that Darwin had. He has become more into the center around some of the recent debates around computational models of cognition. So some of the ideas that were influenced by evolutionary thinking and have over time become kind of sidelined, but he had thought about them, are slowly coming back into fashion. So you might have heard of predictive coding algorithm. So that's an idea that can be indirectly traced all the way back to William James via or influenced by Darwin, because it assumes that the brain creates various ideas of the world, and only those ideas that are best matched to input coming in through the senses would actually be selected. But we're jumping ahead. This is something we might get back to later in this course. So James, really important. He was aware of evolutionary thinking, and he therefore, was theorizing about evolution. If we talk about psychology, we also have to recognize the important role that intelligence tests have played for the better and the worse. Intelligence tests were first developed in France by a chap called Alfred Binet. He was tasked by the government to identify kids that would need additional help. So note, the idea of an intelligence test was actually created with a positive goal. It was designed, or was supposed to help teachers identify what kids would need more attention in order to learn the material. So they published a first test around the turn of the 20th century. Binet died in 1911, and the test soon got all the way over to the US. And there was this gentleman, Louis Terman, who would take up the ideas and would develop them further. He initially continued working on IQ testing in kids, but soon developed tests for adults as well. And as the war broke out, World War I, huge casualties, huge impact, he was tasked with using his IQ test to identify recruits that could be trained for higher positions within the army. So that was the first modern adaptation of a psychometric psychological test to identify individuals for specific jobs. And so what happened now is all these recruits in the US Army had to answer some version of his IQ test, and he had huge amounts of data. And unfortunately now Terman was strongly influenced by Galton. You remember Galton, the cousin of Darwin, and he was doing all this work on hereditary genius, and Galton also created the eugenics movement the way we know today. And Terman now had this idea that potentially he could use the test data to prove some of Galton's ideas, namely that some races are just better than others in terms of cognitive um, development. And as you can imagine, not having proper statistical techniques and having a very biased ideological view, it was not difficult to find all these differences. He did not rule out alternative explanations, and he established a line of thinking that unfortunately resonates still within certain areas of the population. we have the bell curve argument that is a direct descendant of this kind of thinking and this kind of testing, which made a lot of waves in the 80s and 90s. The idea basically being that there are genetic differences between ethnic racial groups that determine their IQ scores, which, if you look at all of the data, it has been discredited, but the idea sticks around. And it was just this week that there was a retraction of a previously published paper that again used IQ scores to make kind of complicated claims about violent crime and religiosity. And the retraction note and the editor statement that was published this week calls attention again to these issues and how data is being used without proper scrutiny of the data sources. So this is just a reminder that evolutionary thinking was present at the beginning of academic psychology as an independent discipline. The perspectives really varied. So the European tradition was quite happily integrating evolutionary thinking in a more complex way. In the US, the beginning with William James also was aware of the importance and the possible implications of evolutionary thinking. At the same time, though, the work on IQ differences quickly channeled the eugenics ideas, Galton's ideas, these race-based ideas, in very specific directions. And even though a lot of this work has been discredited, it still sticks around. But around the turn of the century, this handsome gentleman in Russia conducted some famous experiments that you might heard of that involved bells, lights, and dogs, and he quickly established the paradigm of operant conditioning, classic conditioning, classic conditioning. And for this work, he got the Nobel Prize in Physiology and Medicine in 1904. At the same time, in the US, John Watson also started doing work, also in animals, on learning mechanisms. And in 1913, he gave an address with the title Psychology as the Behaviorist Views It. And this completely changed the course of psychology for a good part of the 20th century. What happened now is people moved away from internal mental worlds and started focusing exclusively on behaviors. Watson's input and Watson's influence meant that psychologists kind of abandoned everything that is not directly observable, and therefore the idea of evolutionary processes and challenges would become irrelevant for psychology. Behaviorism became the dominant school and paradigm in psychology, and it was not till the 1970s that psychologists would again touch mental internal processes. So this was a watershed moment in psychology, which then also meant that evolutionary thinking largely disappeared from the horizon and the radar of psychologists. So, but we had a modern synthesis. What happened now in in biology after the modern synthesis? We have to first of all talk about ethology, because there are some very important ideas that would become central for the study of evolutionary thinking as we move through the history. It is intimately tied to these two gentlemen, Nicholas Tinbergen, a Dutch biologist, and Konrad Lorenz, a German biologist. They had met in Holland before World War II started. They immediately recognized that they had very similar thoughts on studying animal behavior. So the important thing is here that they were interested in understanding animal behavior. So similar to the psychologists, but they wanted to study animal behavior in the field using naturalistic conditions as much as possible. So they struck up a friendship and started a joint program. Then World War II happened, and here Konrad Lorenz was swept up with the enthusiasm that Hitler had created. He joined the Nazi party. He went to war. He was imprisoned in a Russian prisoner of war camp. Tinbergen, on the other hand, was captured by the Nazis, spent years in captivity there, and apparently was highly traumatized that he, for the rest of his lives, apparently was not able to listen to German again. And as you can imagine, these differences really challenged their friendship. And it was only later that Lawrence noted the mistakes and errors that he had made by joining the Nazi party. He apologized, and over time the two of them became friends again and restarted their productive working relationship. And it was through these insights that they gained studying animals in in the wild, looking at behavioral patterns that could be used to describe species overall. They made some really important insights, or they gathered some really important insights about animal behavior. And that also, like another reason that they became kind of famous very quickly is um, they often, especially Konrad Lorenz, would also make speculations about what this could mean for humans. So they gained really important insights for the behavior of animals, and at least for Lawrence, they did not shy away from making some generalizations for human behavior. So famously in the 60s, he wrote a book on aggression in which he argued that being traumatized by the atrocities of the World War, he argued that humans have an inborn drive towards aggression, and this aggression drive needs to be channeled appropriately. As you can imagine, in the 1960s, that caused a lot of controversies, and this discussion still raged on. And in 1991, the UNESCO, partially in response to the discussion that was started by Lawrence, released a Seville statement on violence. So Seville, the city in Spain, they had an expert panel gathering there for some time, and then they came up with a statement that specifically rejected that there's an inborn drive towards violence in humans. This is a very controversial area of research and thinking, and we will come back to some of these ideas and the very complex question of aggression in humans in due course. But this is just to show that these insights that they gained from animal behavior would again be applied to humans without actually having done systematic studies of human behavior. But nevertheless, they got a Nobel Prize in Physiology and Medicine in 1973. Tinbergen moved to the UK, and so the ethology paradigm really became influential, at least in Europe and also to some extent in the US. It was mainly a European movement, the ethology movement, but it strongly influenced biology for sure, and also some psychologists. And it is David Sloan Wilson, one of the great evolutionary biologists, who has made tremendous contributions to the study of human behavior and animal behavior. He published a book in 2019 called This View of Life, in which he lays out um, a method and a process for studying evolution, both in animals and in humans. And he picked up an idea that Tinbergen first proposed, which is you have to ask different questions in order to understand behavior. And so David Sloan Wilson makes a very compelling argument, goes through all these different steps that you have to make in order to, as he calls it, in order to complete the Darwinian revolution. And he uses these 4 Tinbergen questions. So let's have a look at them. Tinbergen asks, in order to understand behavior, you have to ask 4 different questions. The first one is about mechanisms. So up here, upper right, you have to ask, how does a particular trait actually work? What is the structure? What are the physiological mechanisms? What environmental stimuli trigger the mechanism? So it's really a static question about how does a trait work. You can also ask about the function. So what is the function of this trait that enhances reproductive success? So, like, why did evolution create this trait? Or what is the ultimate evolutionary function for this trait? We can also ask some dynamic questions. So we can think about, or we can study, how does the trait actually change over the lifetime of an individual? So ontogeny, how does the trait develop over time? And we can also ask an ultimate or distal question in terms of, how did the trait actually evolve over evolutionary history? So it's a phylogeny question. So as you can see here, it brings Meyer's idea of the proximal versus distal slash ultimate levels of explanation, and it combines it with a very focused static view on what a trait is doing, either physiologically or evolutionary, and how the trait is changing, either in the lifetime of an individual or over evolutionary time. And David Sloan Wilson makes a very convincing argument and gives lots of examples of how we can use those 4 questions to develop an evolutionary program. So that's why the ethology movement is so important, because it set up some mechanisms that can, or it set up some principles that can be used to study behavior over evolutionary time spans, and helps us to understand why specific behaviors, why specific traits are there in the way that they are observable today. In the meantime, in the US, things moved in slightly different directions. But this is something we're going to see in just a few seconds with the next video.